The NCAA is being forced to pay $2.7 billion in damages to current and former athletes, and this isn't going to ruin college sports. This is going to save it. I'm Drew Goldfarb with DGPicks.com. This ruling is going to really impact the Power 5 specifically, and is going to allow for schools to pay their athletes roughly $20 million a year in compensation. This is long overdue and is finally going to allow college athletes to make the kind of money that they really should have been making for the last decade or two. Let's get into the numbers, because in 2016, the NCAA signed a television contract agreement with CBS and Turner Sports worth $1.1 billion a year for what amounts to 67 games during the men's NCAA March Madness basketball tournament. This year, ESPN and the NCAA agreed to terms on a 6-year, $1.3 billion per year agreement that'll see ESPN airing the college football playoff, which amounts to 11 games a year for $1.3 billion. Just those two deals combined gives the NCAA more annual revenue than 23 companies listed on the S&P 500. All of that is to say, there is tons of money in what has supposedly been amateur athletics for a very long time. This is not the NCAA football of the 1960s. There are massive television contracts on the table. Notre Dame won't join a conference because their TV revenue is too good. There is too much money in major college athletics for football, men's and women's college basketball for these kids to not be making any kind of money directly from what is actually their employer. So how does this save college athletics and not ruin it? Well, I think what's going to happen is this is going to lead to a split, where you're going to see the Power 5, formerly Power 5 schools, finally break away from the rest of the FBS, so this way the schools with all of the revenue can properly pay their players. And the schools that, let's face it, never have had a chance at playing for a national championship in the FBS dating back to the BCS days will finally have an opportunity to compete for games that really mean something. Because if you remove the Power 5, those remaining 60 to 70 teams that will stay behind in FBS will now be playing in their own postseason tournament. Instead of playing in the Cricket Wireless Papa John's Home.com Tostitos Bowl presented by Gronk in mid-December, they'll actually have their own tournament they can play in, which means that now schools that will not be moving on with the Power 5 in what I think is going to be an eventual split into its own thing will be the top amateur programs in the country. And that's not something you've been able to say about any school that isn't Alabama, LSU, Florida State, Florida, Miami, Georgia. You haven't been able to say that about schools that are not them, or Michigan, Ohio State, USC, in decades. And then if you're a fan of a Power 5 school, this is actually really good for you as well, because when you have that break off, if those schools are able to all come together to negotiate media rights just for football, men's and women's college basketball, well, now every team is going to have a much more level playing field. You end up with media rights that are negotiated jointly by all of these teams. And for the purposes of that, they're essentially acting as one organization. So instead of the SEC having its own TV deal and the ACC being saddled with a lesser one and the Pac-12 now being down to 2 teams because everyone's fleeing for the Big Ten or the SEC or the ACC or the Big 12 or anybody, now you have one central location negotiating for the best possible TV deal. And that means that the revenue that is going to be split amongst teams is going to be more even, which means you should see more parity across the league. Because when you have leagues that do something like this, look at the NHL, you get parity. And having that budget and that parity means that when you're having big prospects, not everybody's just going to be like, ooh, Alabama, ooh, Georgia, I'm going to go there and be a third string. Well, you know what? Georgia can only offer you a certain amount of money because they've already got 7 prospects that are ranked higher than you at your general position group. So do you want to be the 7th highest paid linebacker at Georgia? Or do you want to be the highest paid linebacker at Syracuse? Well, now you've got an option. And if you're doing that, you're going to see more parity. And when you see more parity, it's more competitive. And when it's more competitive, it's more entertaining. There's a reason that postseasons that have more parity are so entertaining. When you don't know exactly what's going to happen when Georgia plays Vanderbilt, that's way more exciting than when you go, all right, is Georgia going to win this game by 60 or are they going to win by 70? Well, now if Vandy has an opportunity to compete because they're able to recruit using money that Georgia is having to lock up with other players, now those games get competitive. Also, if you do split the Power 5 away from the other conferences in the FBS and let them just merge into one, well, now you could go back to true geographic, historical, rivalry-based conferences and stop with having Cal playing in the same conference as Boston College and Miami. That is something that would become a thing of the past, because in those schools, in those programs, they could just go back to being in a PAC conference. They could play in the same conference as Oregon and UCLA and USC, because the Pac-12 would, for football and college basketball, be a part of the same organization as the SEC. So it doesn't matter where they're getting their television money or what conference they're lining up in, because the money's going to be the same regardless of which team they're playing against. And that also helps the schools' programs that are not those big three, the men's and women's college basketball and college football, because it means that you're not talking about taking the gymnastics program from Cal Berkeley and having them compete against Wake Forest on a regular basis, or taking the softball team or the baseball team and having them go across the country for in-conference games. It allows so much of college athletics to finally be corrected and fixed. And if you're asking what's the difference between college football, men's and women's college basketball, and the other sports that I mentioned, college baseball, college softball, college hockey, well, the biggest difference, there's two, is the revenue generated, and on an equal field is if you're playing baseball or hockey, you can go pro at 18. You don't have to go to college. Major League Baseball, you can be drafted out of your high school senior year. Just that easily. You could go and sign your deal and take your signing bonus and go play Class A, AA, whatever baseball, whatever you're qualified for, and go pro immediately. College hockey, you could skip it if you get drafted high enough, go straight into the NHL. Plenty of players, not a ton every year, but you do get at least a couple of 18-year-olds that end up in the NHL right after they're drafted in the first round. If you had an alternative, if you could go pro out of high school, well, so many of these athletes who are worth so much money, their name, their image, their likeness is worth so much money, would simply bypass the NCAA entirely. And that's what used to be the case, especially in men's college basketball, where so many players just decided to go straight out of high school. You saw it with Kobe Bryant, you saw it with Kevin Garnett, you saw it with LeBron James. Never set foot on a college basketball court because they went straight to the NBA. Well, that hasn't been allowed in a number of years, and now you have to have an alternative. You cannot go direct into the NBA from high school, even if you're good enough. So you have to get paid to do it because you are worth millions and millions of dollars. The only thing that's different between the guy who's going to college for 1 year now and LeBron James, if they're drafted first overall, is that LeBron James had the option of making money in his first year out of high school. These kids that go to the NCAA, that go to Duke, UNC, Kentucky, Louisville, anywhere, and end up getting drafted highly in the first round, didn't have an alternative. So now this is finally going to remedy that. It's finally going to fix that, and college athletes, long overdue, are finally getting paid. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? And why? Do let me know why if you do disagree with me down in the comments below. I'm Drew Goldfarb. Make sure you head over to dgpicks.com where I'm doing sports betting breakdowns, picks, tips, analysis, fun videos like this throughout the week, throughout the month, throughout the year, and I will see you next time.